Hello and welcome back to the Wandering Cantos. Today I wanted to talk about a anime I just finished and just kind of make a short little review for it. So today we're going to be talking about 365 Days to the Wedding. So spoiler warning for the whole first season, which may end up being the whole show. I've not read the manga and I've not seen the live action show. So there won't be any spoilers for that, but I also ask that you refrain from spoiling anything from the manga in the comments, etc., since I actually think I'll want to check it out in the near future. So yeah, just wanted to give that quick warning, and now I think we can jump right into it. All right, so just to sort of jump right into the discussion. So 365 Days to the Wedding sort of has a, standard fake romance equals ultimate real romance sort of story arc, if you will. The whole like fake lovers to lovers thing. So the general premise is that Takia and Rika both work at a travel agency, and the travel agency is going to form a new branch in Alaska. So they're going to have to send an employee over there to help kind of oversee and manage that new branch. So they've decided that in order to pick who they're going to send, they're going to prioritize unmarried individuals so they won't be breaking up a family, etc. Well, Rika doesn't want to leave because she's happy with being at home with her maps and all of that, and Takia doesn't want to leave because he has a cat he's taking care of. So they come up with the brilliant idea to pretend to suddenly be getting married in order to avoid getting sent over. And as it always goes, hijinks ensue. So I have sort of a soft spot for these sort of silly romances that are usually pretty clean and basically have to do with a sort of absurd setup. I kind of enjoy that type of comedy when it's mixed into romance. I'm not actually a big like rom-com fan or really like a romance fan in general. But occasionally I enjoy checking out stuff like this as something just sort of easier to put on. So yeah, I feel like I wanted to mostly make this video in order to sort of shout out this show and recommend it to people who haven't checked it out yet. But yeah, I thought, we can give it a sort of our normal treatment. So here we have our two main characters, and then obviously here we have our secondary characters. So we have the boss of the branch, a sort of wise, interesting employee who has sort of a mysterious background, a coworker who is looking for romance, the cat that we mentioned, sort of a more handsome, charismatic coworker, the father of Takia, a childhood friend, another coworker who's sort of like the Pam from The Office, if you will, which Hiromi is interested in. Then we have the mom of Rika, and Sho is a character who basically goes through a divorce. And so what's interesting about a lot of these characters is they sort of reflect different types of relationships, as our main characters are sort of trying to navigate their own relationship, because as we've already sort of talked about, by being in a fake romance and being in a fake marriage, they actually start to develop feelings for each other, and it ultimately ends with getting married. So the boss seems to be initially potentially an antagonist because she is the one who's deciding who she's going to send to Alaska. However, she also actually is married, and she sort of fell in love with her husband through going on adventures and traveling, and she actually misses traveling as a result. George seems to have maybe gone through a divorce, but he's sort of more wisely, having had processed it. Not clear if it's a divorce or a breakup, but he sort of has good romance and relationship advice. So he sort of signifies sort of the end of that show. As we said, he is currently going through a divorce, and he sort of reflects how sometimes we can be selfish in our joy of a relationship, where you might be so happy in a relationship you don't actually check in to see if your partner is happy, but also is sort of someone who has like defined themselves by their relationship. So it's also sort of a cautionary tale in that way, because when his relationship falls apart, he falls apart. The father is, a father figure, but he has a good relationship with his wife, while Rika's mom had a bad relationship with her husband, which has sort of reflected her sort of her outlook on relationships and some of her like abandonment issues, because she was suddenly separated from her dad, and as a result, she tends to close herself off emotionally. Now is the childhood friend and sort of like an accidental antagonist, because she makes Rika jealous and makes Rika think that Taki is actually interested in her, when ultimately he's really interested in Rika. Natsumi is a love interest for, honestly, I would argue, two of the people here, which is Kisuke and Hirumi. So she's a love interest. And yeah, so Ritsu is sort of an example of getting maybe too caught up in career and work goals, so that you sort of abandon a relationship. So it's pretty interesting how, all these characters sort of fit in and sort of teach and guide, or at least serve as cautionary tales, things like that. And as a result, in terms of the actual story sort of arc, I really enjoyed it. From, we have our introduction. I liked meeting the characters, the inciting incident of these two pretending to get married, and for a long time, there's actually a very cute and satisfying sort of upward trajectory of them potentially falling in love with each other. Especially we see it a lot with Rika. So then when she sees Now, she sort of gets, she shuts down, because she realizes that she was getting too caught up in her own sort of fantasy in her head, and started to believe that Takia might have liked her. So the thing is she's wrong about her presumptions here, but it's kind of a bummer, because in my opinion, the show sort of takes a dip in enjoyability after this point, because their relationship, not until the very, very end, it feels like they never returned to this point where they were, because after that, she's actually very like cold to him, and kind of pushes him away, but it's because of her own sort of self-deprecation. But then they start to kind of get back together, but she's much more stiff and awkward. At one point they have to like temporarily move in together to trick their coworkers, and she devises this whole system where they have to raise their hand before they can speak and all of this stuff, and that just makes her just like dynamic much more stilted. So it's not as fun as back when they were going to like his childhood home to meet his parents, and they were pretending to be lovers, so they were much more like cute together, if that makes sense. And then you add on to it that because of her self-deprecation, she, for example, takes them on a date, but she's like intentionally cold and standoffish, because she's sort of trying to scare Takia off and show him like, see, I'm boring, you don't actually like me, you just like the idea of me. But he does actually like her. So there's just quite a couple scenarios where their dynamic is just so much more cold and like conflict ridden, that like I was nostalgic for this more earlier part. And then for example, they also have a moment moment where they kiss, but then she immediately walks away and sort of like leaves him there, and that just always sort of takes the wind out of the sails. But the ending of the show is really cute and satisfying as they get together and realize they do in fact want to be together, even though there's struggles with being married. Because again, as they go through their adventures, they sort of observe other people's relationships because they're both introverts and sort of like their independence and like being alone to a degree. So they start to realize that there's a lot of work that a relationship requires, etc., etc., etc. But ultimately, they realize they like each other so much that it's worth all of those potential struggles in order to be together. So, cute ending, but I was sort of bummed because I was so on board with the show up to, really up until Erika takes them on that date where she's like super cold and distant, because it was just after that point I kind of started to not like her character, while before I really enjoyed the dynamic between the both characters and was cheering them both on. And as any other romance fans know, if you don't like one of the characters of the main couple, the quality of the show or story in general tends to dip. That being said, something else I wanted to mention is that I get that they were using Hiromi as sort of, or Ganda as sort of an example of learning about romance and how romance can be hard and how you can't falter and how you have to think about the other person and how you also don't always know everything about the other person. But I was super, super, super bummed that the show ended without him getting sort of his redemption, because in the show, he struggles with dating, and then he meets this girl who he actually gets along with, and she's attractive to him, and they have a lot of fun, and they, talk for hours on the phone, all of the sort of honeymoon stuff. And then he gets so caught up in it that he basically is like, we should date and then eventually get married. And she suddenly gets cold, and she brings him to a daycare and reveals that she's a single mom, and is basically like, are you willing to still commit to me knowing this? And you can tell that she's sort of been burned by men before. And he falters, but then, the next day immediately he's like, I have no problem with her having a child, and I want to be with her, etc. But then he basically just sort of gives up because he tries to talk to her once and it doesn't work out, and she sends a friend instead. So I was really hoping that as the show progressed, we'd eventually see this relationship in the background also grow, or at the end of the show we'd see they're together. But the show actually just ends with him looking at one of the old pictures of the two of them and crying. So you can sort of imply that maybe after the events of the show he'll eventually pursue her, but just sort of unsatisfied with that. I thought it was sort of a bummer, especially because they spend so much time building up his character and discussing his backstory. He had like a really abusive childhood growing up, and so he wants to start a family and have like a whole safe space, and he really wants to have kids, so the relationship dynamic's perfect. So it's sort of one of those frustrating things where it's like, if the characters would just communicate with one another, they'd be able to get over the hurdle, which, to be fair, a great deal of the main relationship also has that problem, where if they could just open up with one each other and just be honest, a lot of the sort of struggles they go through just wouldn't even happen. So overall, I think this one is a super cute show. I really enjoyed it. Again, I was a little disappointed by the second half and where it went, just because it felt like it sort of got derailed. But that being said, I would, highly recommend it to anyone who wants sort of a cuter anime romance, especially because it's sort of unique for the genre in that it follows a bunch of 20-year-olds as they're sort of navigating the world as being young adults in that sense. So it was really fun in that way. Again, just a bit bummed by the latter half. So with that, I think I'm going to wrap this one up, and I will see you in the next one.